I am so happy to be here at Spring Book Fest 2023. I'm Deborah Herman, and I'm here with my book collaborator and friend Dianne Lake. We co-authored this book, Member of the Family, and it's Dianne's memoir of being the youngest member in the Manson family cult. Dianne did not participate in the crimes, but was a member from almost the beginning and was with them in the desert after the crimes were committed, not knowing what happened until they all confessed to her. Then in the desert with them until their arrest, and ultimately she testified against them. So that's the overall, but I'm sure you want to hear from Dianne directly of what it was like and how it all began. So Dianne, tell the listeners, how did you wind up with Charles Manson? You know, I before we wrote the book together, I was always curious, you know, how a person would wind up in this kind of cult, and if there was any red flag ahead of time, or what was it like back then?
Well, it was the 60s. My dad was an intellectual artist primarily, and he and my mom got turned on to marijuana and ended up getting involved with the newspaper, the underground newspaper, the Oracle, that started in San Francisco, and then they made an edition in Los Angeles. And he was like contributing artwork, and they lost their lease, moved in with the majority of them moved in with us in Santa Monica. And then they just got interested in the whole Timothy Leary philosophy.
Yeah, this was the psychedelic time. And that made a big difference even in your father's artwork, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, he started really getting into the day glow neon colors and
the tripping.
Right. And so anyway, they decided that they had turned on, they were tuning in, and now they were going to drop out. And he and this one of the other men in the group got bread trucks, turned them into campers. We sold all of our stuff and moved, 5 of us, 2 adults and 3 children, of which I was the oldest, moved into a bread truck outfitted as a camper and went on down the beach. You know?
So this is, you know, what people don't understand is this is not crazy for the times. There were a lot of people looking into alternative ways of living. The psychedelic movement and Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg, they were giving people advice on how to find your bliss and how to live better, and then how to pass that on to your children. But for your family, it kind of didn't work out, did it?
Right. Well, I mean, you know, my parents had faith and they wanted to get closer to God, really. And my dad was always shirking materialism.
Yeah.
You know, and he pontificated about it a lot. And so that this was meaningful. You know, this was a meaningful journey that wasn't just a drug-induced odyssey, although it ended up kind of being that way. But anyway, so we left, but it was, you know, it was cramped space. And one morning, you know, my mom, I made pancakes, and my mom got up and criticized me because I wasn't turning them over at the right time. And so I just I'm 14. I'm
right,
kind of frustrated.
Exactly.
You know, it's
You're
like I'm trying to help, you know, we're living in, anyway. So I just left out of the van and went on down the beach and met a little boy who wanted somebody to push him on the swing. And then his parents came over, and his parents were kind of like hippies. And so they invited us to come and live at his mother's house with him, actually. And we took acid together. And I had.
How old were you when you had your first acid trip?
I was 13.
And
My first acid trip was in my living room in Santa Monica that my father had given me and my two best girlfriends a tab of acid, and we listened to music. We listened to Beatle music, and we read Timothy Leary's Tibetan Book of the Dead.
and again, putting it in context of the times, and what you said is very important. The parents really thought that by doing this with their children, they were going to raise their consciousness and help them to become more aware. And, it wasn't just that he wanted to party with his kid. This was a real sacrament.
It truly was. I mean, this was
not that it's a good idea.
Right. But that's how it got in. We got into that. And so I thought I heard on this acid trip at Zuma Beach, I thought I heard God saying, it's time for you to leave home.
So the next stop, there were many stops in between, and I don't think we have time to cover all of them. That's why this is such a long book. But let's flash forward to your parents are now, you've gone in all directions. Your parents are now at the very well-known commune, the Hog Farm. That's where Wavy Gravy was, and you took a circuitous path on your own, going to San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury, all of that. Now you're looking to reconnect with your parents, and what happens?
So when I come back from Big Sur, I'm looking for my parents, and I found them, and this couple that I had connected with in Zuma, I found them that they were all living at the Hog Farm. And
what was that place like?
It was really, it was a house on the top of a hill in the foothills of Los Angeles, and they actually were raising hogs there.
Oh.
The owner was raising hogs, the owner of the property, and then he wanted somebody to come and help take care of them. And so then that was Wavy Gravy. Wasn't known as Wavy Gravy then. His name was Hugh Romney, and his wife was Bonnie Jean. And so the two of them moved in, and then some of their close friends moved in.
How many
with them
eventually? Like, how many were there?
I think there was probably 20 people living there when I showed up. But my parents had already sort of emancipated me. They had actually written a note giving me permission to be on my own and live with this other couple. And so
did they greet you lovingly when you showed up at the Hog Farm?
Yeah, my parents did, for sure. They weren't totally we weren't totally disenfranchised from each other, but I was no longer really their responsibility, and they weren't really behaving like parents, even with my two younger siblings.
How is that?
Because in a commune, all the adults are kind of looking out for the kids. And my parents were still struggling with their relationship, and the new realm of what does the man do in this relationship, what does the woman do. It's no longer mom's the cook and cleaner, and
although
dad fixes the car.
Yeah, but at the commune, didn't it turn out to be very traditional?
Kind of.
The women were doing the cooking, and the men were.
Yes.
Yeah, it's funny, but it was a time they were questioning all of that.
True. But anyway, Hugh Romney and they had a lot of young, men, musicians mostly, coming up to the farm, they called it, and playing music and getting high, and the neighbors down the road, they didn't like this, and they actually had guards posted to keep people from going up there. And so anyway, Hugh and Bonnie Jean came to me and had a very serious conversation with me that they really were uncomfortable with my being there because I was considered jailbait.
So it would put you in a very difficult position.
And I could stay in the attic, but I didn't want to sleep in the attic.
Yeah, it's like being an outcast.
And so I don't think my parents were ever even really aware of this conversation until many years later. But I think that Hugh and Bonnie Jean had a couple of friends that lived, somewhere else, and they came and invited me to come live with them shortly thereafter, which I did. And they are the ones that said, "Hey, we want you to, we're going to a party. We think that, we want you to meet this groovy guy and his girls." And so off we went, and I walked up the stairs, and everybody knew me.
Now, how did that happen? Because that's a very curious,
right? But it was
more than coincidence. It was like
to me at that age, at 14, and not feeling welcome at this last place. These people really embraced me. Charlie, Dianne is here, and I'm just blown away. How do they know my name? Well, turns out that Charlie had visited the hog farm, and he'd kind of befriended my mom and my dad, and they'd actually gone on a trip out to the Mojave Desert looking for gas tanks. Charlie was obsessed with gas tanks, or a place to store fuel, because he anyway. So
it all makes sense in the end.
In one of the conversations, my mom, I was in San Francisco at that point when Charlie had visited them at the hog farm, and she gave him my picture, and because they were going to be going to San Francisco, and said, "Hey, if you see my daughter, bring her home, say hi." I don't know what the intent was, but it was like, yeah, there was a connection there. So they all knew me. And I kind of bounced back and forth for a couple of weeks between the farm and Charlie's Charlie and the girls. And then they were going to take a bus trip to New Mexico and Arizona.
I want to go back to that moment of complete love bomb.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Charlie got up. They were all in a circle when I got to this party. They were all in a circle. Charlie was playing music, and they were singing, and Charlie was drinking root beer. We didn't drink beer or wine, really. Anyway, so he got up, offered me a sip of his root beer, and said, "Oh, so this is our Dianne."
Yeah, 14 years old. It must have felt like it was something kismet, supernatural, and then, as you said,
he invited me to join the circle.
Yeah.
And then that evening he invited me into the bus and made incredible love to me, which was amazing. I didn't feel like, he made me feel like a woman.
And that was
desirable woman.
Absolutely. And that was one of the things he did to bring people into the group, the women, and to get them to stay. Don't you think?
Oh, definitely. Because he had this ability, which apparently he had learned at the knee of some of the pimps in jail, that, how you get a woman to stay is that you make her feel like she's the one and only, and you're the favorite, and just, fabulous. And he definitely, at 14, I was very vulnerable and very naive, but it worked.
Yeah. And I can see how, without getting too much off track, this is a technique that works all the time. We still see it today. With vulnerable people. You were someone seeking. You were from a family of people who were looking for higher consciousness. And he was, at that time, he looked like many of the other gurus.
I would say so. And I think that's why he didn't make it at the hog farm, because Hugh Romney and Charlie were two,
gurus,
guru forces,
fighting for domination,
were in control. And so,
and other places he tried, but he fit into what was happening at the time in California and other places as well. But California certainly was the leader in the Flower Child movement, anti-war, and everybody had long hair. They played guitar, and
Yeah,
you know,
it
and
was
he had his Charlie-isms.
yeah, he was not, he really didn't stand out in that way, except that he had, you know, a group of women that, so we were like sister wives. There were other men, and he was always looking for, other men to join the family. He didn't want to be the only, male.
But he did want to be the supreme male.
Right. I mean, he thought his philosophy, he wrote many, all the songs we sang were Charlie songs. And, those were important to him. And I think they were, they were the purveyors of his philosophy.
Now, what, and we'll go back into the story, but what made you want to write your story? You were hidden after everything. You know, not to jump too far ahead, but, you lived with them. Well, maybe talk a little bit about what it was like at Spahn Ranch, and then when things started to go south. Did you notice that he was becoming more delusional, maybe, if that's the word, or more aggressive?
We lived several places, around Topanga, and then we found Spahn Ranch, and it was, kind of away from the population, basically. And George was blind.
George Spahn was the owner of the ranch.
He was the owner of the ranch, and it had been, a movie studio backdrop, like there's Corriganville. There's a bunch of different Western movie sets.
What was that place like? I mean, I would think before things were really getting heavy, as they would say back then, I would think being there would be like a teenager's dream. What was it like for you there? It must have been make-believe.
It was beautiful. I mean, that part of the Santa Susana Pass is just beautiful, big round rocks and caves and green hills and sycamores. And it was, it was really, it's a very special piece of land out there. And I used to wander around, and, I tried riding the horses, and that didn't go well.
Yeah, it was an actual farm. I mean, it was a ranch.
Yeah, they rented, so it had gotten to the point where they rented out horses for, weekend, daily. And so there was a barn, and so we all, Charlie kind of bamboozled George, and Lynette took over, kind of.
That's Squeaky.
Taking.
How do you say her last name?
Squeaky. From. And he would kind of, she had been tasked with basically taking care of him, and,
keeping him happy,
keeping him happy. Yes.
And he was a frisky old man.
Mucked out, we mucked out the stalls, and, we lived here and there in the beginning. And then there was a ranch house at the back. And eventually there was another commune actually living back there. And when they moved out, we moved in. And it was about a quarter mile down from where the ranch was. And so that's where we basically stayed. But it was, it was lovely place. And I felt very free, basically, most of the time. And, in the evenings we get together and play music, sing Charlie's songs, and, smoke marijuana and take LSD on a rather frequent basis. But
how could things that seemed so idyllic eventually turn so dark? Were there signs that, like it wasn't just one day where he decided there was going to be this race war? Did he talk about that? Did he give you guys, like, people talk about brainwashing. Did you get a lot of Charlie's philosophy when you were there?
We did. And one of his main themes from the very beginning, because he'd spent that time in prison, was that there was going to be this black-white race war. And so he was like trying to prepare us for this inevitable. It's like talking about the apocalypse, and that he kind of alluded to that's what it was, but it, you know, it was all mixed up with the apocalypse and this black-white race war, and that anyway. So one of the gals that came to join us, her grandparents had a house way up in Death Valley.
We have been there together, and I could not believe how remote this place is. This was ultimately, well, there were two places that you looked at, because he really was becoming paranoid, whether it was, you know, but it was this apocalyptic vision at that time because of his experience in prison, and it was the time of, you know, the Black Panthers and a lot of, well, civil rights, but also a lot of almost violent activism. We had groups that were, instead of, it was moving away from peaceful protest to where there were several groups that were becoming, you know, almost like the beginnings of a form of domestic terrorism. So, you know, he was distorting a lot of that in his own mind, and then feeding that to you all. And eventually he wanted to get you out of Spahn Ranch.
Right. And he had several encounters. I think that we went up there, he liked what he saw. He wanted to get away, be safe. And then he had this, he talked about in the beginning that he'd had this crucifixion experience in San Francisco, and he would reenact that periodically. And I think, and then he heard about the bottomless pit, and so he thought the bottomless pit was in Death Valley somewhere. So,
and that it was real. He believed it.
That was a place to hide out until this war was over. And then he thought that, you know, that the winners, which he said was going to be the black man, was going to be the winner, and that they weren't going to know how to. That he wasn't going to talk about it. He wasn't going to know how to rule, and so he was going to come and get Charlie and the girls, right?
Whatever it was, whoever was going to win, he had a very distorted view of everything. But that's kind of where he put his delusion.
Right. But I think what accelerated it was that he wanted money. He wanted money to finance this move to the desert and get supplies and gas, you know, so that and dune buggies. And that kind of was, you know, his frenzy was starting to fuel up because he wanted the money. So they started doing, I think, a drug deal here and there, and some of those went bad. He thought that, you know, he'd shot a black man at one point, and he was, you know, super paranoid about that. Anyway, everything just started escalating. He got a motorcycle gang to kind of join us at Spahn Ranch, and they brought guns and knives, and they started stealing
dune buggies.
They stole VW bugs and converted them into dune buggies, right? And so it just got really frenetic.
So ultimately, you find yourself way up in Death Valley at a place called Barker Ranch. You are there with a couple of other people. Then you feel left out because you're not included in a lot of these things. And so you wanted to.
Charlie had left me in the desert and, you know, admonished me, stay here till I come back, you know, until we come back. And I didn't. And Bobby Beausoleil came up and was looking for some girls to help him panhandle money. And like Deb said, I've had felt somewhat abandoned and left out. And so I volunteered to go with Bobby, and we went down to the valley, San Fernando Valley. And now they're not at Spahn Ranch. They're at this Gresham Street house, which had been nicknamed like the Yellow Submarine House. And Charlie was furious with me. Just what
Now,
the heck are you? I told you to stay in the desert.
Now I don't want to, we're going to run out of time, and this is a very complex story. So I'm going to flash forward ahead. At that point, Charlie is now deep into the delusion that the Beatles are talking to him, and now he's accelerated, and he, unbeknownst to you, the horrible crimes are committed, and he sends you off, and you're at the foot to go of the road to go up to Barker, where everybody's supposed to meet, and you're kind of, I mean, there's details, but you're very innocent about this until you meet up with Tex Watson, who shows you these headlines of these awful crimes and says,
he slaps the paper,
yeah,
and he says, I did this. Charlie told me to.
And then you're stuck.
And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I had just been picked up by the sheriff for 24 hours because they thought I was a runaway. Yeah. And then, I don't know.
You could have been spared, and instead you wind up with them.
And then he they let me go, and he took me back to where he'd picked me up. And I went, and Tex was like livid, with worry, where was I? And so, and he's got this newspaper. And so then it's just, then like, you realized
who you were with.
I couldn't believe it that Tex and these other women that I had, loved and been with
could do those horrible things.
Could do this. How did it just didn't make sense.
So in our last minutes, you ultimately were spared. You were adopted by your, you went into the foster system, and ultimately you did testify against them. And then you went on and had a life. So, and nobody knew who you were. They didn't, your children didn't know about it. Your husband did. What made you want to write your story? It was like, what, 47 years past or less? How many years were you able to keep this a secret?
Well, there was a sheriff who had a cadaver dog, and he said that the cadaver dog had alerted on human remains up at Barker Ranch. And so he called me, I think it was in 2009, to alert me. He said, because if the dog finds human remains, you're going to be right in the middle of it, and I wanted to give you a heads up. So that's when I told my kids. And then my husband got sick, and he died in 2014. And I was just kind of floundering, grieving. What am I going to do with my life? And I'd gone to a personal development kind of seminar, and they took us through this exercise from birth to death. And I had this epiphany that now was the time to write my story. And, I wanted to give glory to God. And I think that my pastor had given a sermon recently about, just using what God had given you to give him the glory. And so it was like, that was kind of the epiphany. It's like, oh, wow. I went through a very dark place, and I've held it a secret for a really long time. And now my husband's gone, and I was kind of looking for, what do I do now? What do I do? And like I said, I had this epiphany that it was time to write my story. And so I got a life coach, and I started writing. Basically what it was chronological memories. And at the end of it, she said, okay, now you need an agent. And so a friend of mine gave me a guidebook to agents and publishers, and it was her husband, Jeff Herman, who wrote the book. And I really didn't want to have an agent on the East Coast. So I called somebody on the West Coast, but I wanted somebody that at least believed in God, or was a Christian, or at least, a belief in a higher power. And so Jeff had asked the agents in the book whether or not they did. And so I dog-eared those agents, and then I came across an excerpt that he puts in the guidebook that is an excerpt from her book,
which now is an excerpt in this book, my new book, Spiritual Writing from Inspiration
and it
to
really
Publication.
it just resonated with me, and I thought, why not have an agent on the East Coast, right? So I called him, and she'd been convalescing from surgery and had started reading Jeff Gwynn's book about Manson, and got all, and she's a 60s buff anyway.
Yeah.
And so she dove into that. Her husband said, "What are you reading this stuff for?" Right? Because she started reading all this Manson information.
Well, I also loved Helter Skelter because I studied journalism and law and wanted to write, creative nonfiction or true crime. Because it was well written. And so I even was going back over that. And then we got your email.
Yeah, and then I didn't follow. There's all these protocols, for eliciting an agent and publishing a book. And I didn't do anything. I just, there's an email. "Hi, I'm Dianne Lake, former member of the Manson family. I'm interested in writing a book. Would you be my agent?"
Well, and at first I just was going to have the agency do it. And then it's like I got this bonk on the head. You've been waiting for this story and this opportunity for really your entire writing career. So I threw my hat in the ring, and we met. And it was a wonderful journey together. At first I got Diane's chronological description, and then we had to go back and unpack the story. The first time that I interviewed Dianne, it was like a person sitting and then the person across the room. There was a detachment. And there were some things that Dianne told me, and I had to go back and say, wait, what? And go deeper. And it took a long time, because when you're interviewing someone, especially with this level of buried trauma and secrets, you don't want to push too fast and too far. It is a sacred honor to take someone's story and then help them to write it. So it took us a while, and luck had it. It was lightning in a bottle. We were able to find the publisher that we really wanted, and then the fun began.
Yeah, and basically the first draft, they wanted it written in 3 months. It was like, what?
But
the first,
I did
it, but we did it in 6.
Yeah,
so I mean,
because it was
the publisher signed on in January, and the book was published in October of
released October of 2017 in hardcover, in this beautiful hardcover. And now it's still in paperback, ebook, and audio, where Dianne is actually reading the book. But it's really developed a large following. We even just taught a class at Cornell. People are fascinated with.
I don't know if we taught the class, but we presented.
We presented at the class. Yeah, that's true. But we were invited. It's a class on that period of time, and on the Manson family. And I don't. A year after our book came out, I was handed this manuscript. It was in a drawer, and it's by the jury foreman from the Manson trial. And it even had notes from Dianne's testimony. She was, I believe, the last witness, and of course, one of the most important. And it's got, illustrations but I can't show it.
It's
It's too
glare.
bright. But he said to me, I mean, this book was sitting in a drawer since 1973, and it had not only it had all these details. It was the first time a jury had been sequestered for as long as it had. And then what I was able to do was I went back to the original trial transcript. It's 20,000 pages. And whenever Herman Tubik, the jury foreman, would say something like, and Manson jumped across and threw a pencil at the judge, and the judge would say, okay, in chambers. I was able to see what happened behind the scenes, and it's so much of a revelation of how Manson was able to manipulate everything, how brainwashed the members were. Thank God, I think for you you spent time in a mental facility. It really helped you.
Yeah, almost 9 months.
For your protection, not only for your health.
Right. But it gave me my life back, really. And then, my arresting officer in Death Valley, he took me in as his foster child and really gave me back my self-worth and
a childhood. You were treated like part of a real family.
Yeah. It was good.
You guidance.
It was good.
And he even helped you. I mean, you became a teacher ultimately. That's triumph. Could have gone so many other directions.
I have a lot of I need to acknowledge God in this whole journey, in preserving me, preserving my sanity, preserving my life, and giving me the ability to lead a normal life. I mean, I was married for 36 years and I have 3 children. I have 3 grandchildren now. Very important. And so it was good. And I really have to give the glory to God, and even bringing Deb and I together,
Yeah.
we're
still buzzed.
It was just too many. God just opened the doors, and the fact that we were able to write the book, she wrote the first draft, or we wrote the first draft in 3 months. And then, the editing and all that, throwing out pages and legal and all hurt. That stuff. That all
that part hurt, throwing out pages.
That was another 3,
What I loved about the experience was working with a great editor too. And I can't stress the importance of that enough, because he was able to show us the pacing, that there were, when someone takes out a scene, it's because the reader has an expectation that by this time you will have already met Manson, or by this time, there's a real technique to writing memoir, and it was a wonderful experience. You really are an inspiration, and I'm very grateful that you allowed me to collaborate with you on this book. And it answered so many questions that I think people need to think about. This is a cautionary tale. People think, oh, it never would have happened to me. You were a flower child. You wound up in a garden of weeds.
I've talked to many people who said, oh yeah, that could have been me, or that they even met Charlie along the way somewhere.
So, I'm very grateful. And, we've had a lot of positive reviews on the book. And I think it's a very honest, authentic portrayal. You were very brave to not hold back. Of course, it doesn't go, you weren't at the crime scenes, but they confessed to you. So, there are people who say, well, I don't want to read about that, but we purposely did not focus on the horrible,
the
the
crime.
graphic, and
Yeah.
we didn't, because it's not necessary. If people want that, there are many other books that do go into detail. But the importance of this book is really a triumph and learning to move beyond secrets. That was one of the things.
Yeah. And it was interesting because the book came out right at the time when the Me Too movement really got a big, boost.
Yeah. So it was good timing. And I think it's helping people to look at, let's just say, unequal relationships and losing their power to someone else. And your book is about reclaiming your power.
Definitely.
That's the lesson to be learned. And I'd kind of like to have 14-year-olds read it. I mean, I don't know if their parents will let them, but because you really thought that you knew everything.
And what teenager doesn't? I mean, that's why they kind of, there's this split, the generational gap. And that's because, teenagers think they know it all. They know just enough to think they know it all, but not enough to know that they don't know it all, and that their parents are dumb as rocks.
That's true.
And I didn't think my parents were dumb as rocks, but I
but
still
you were
thought
independent.
And actually, I got my parents to believe it as well, because they let me go.
So in the last few minutes, do you have any advice for someone who wants to write their story, their memoir?
Do it. I mean, because I think we need to share our stories. I mean, history shows that a lot of people don't, they keep their story secret. They don't want people to know that they were imperfect, that they made bad choices, or that they were overpowered, or that they were taken advantage of. People it's a pride thing. We don't want people to know that. But the more that we share that, the more that other people maybe can learn from it. And it's not like everybody's experience is going to resonate with other people, but enough people maybe will resonate with it and go, oh, maybe I should,
not do that, or
watch
maybe
out.
Someone else won't.
Maybe people aren't as good or loving as we think they are.
Maybe there are people who are. So it's, because your book is very hopeful, and even with all the darkness, the message is hopeful, and that you can overcome, and that you can prevail. You are a real survival story. So
even for parents, I think even for parents whose children have gone off the deep end into drugs or whatever, has happened to them, that they can come back.
And not to give up hope, because certainly if people want to talk about trauma and challenge, I don't think there are many stories that are more traumatic and challenging than yours.
Well, I don't know about that. There are definitely some.
Well, I think it stands as a good example.
Well, thank you.
And
I thank you for being such a good collaborator. And
it was fun.
She was able to, dig out or, finesse out the story, of my trauma.
Well, I'll leave writers with this last thought. It's really important to be trustworthy and to be intuitive and to be present if you're going to work with someone to write their story, and to accept the huge responsibility that it is. So I think we're coming to the end. This is very exciting, and I appreciate that we're sharing this with the Spring Book Fest 2023. This is Dianne Lake. I am Deborah Herman. We collaborated on this book, Member of the Family, which is available everywhere. And you can also get this book, Inside the Manson Jury, which is also available wherever books are sold. And we hope to do other projects together, but if not, thank goodness we have a very lasting friendship.